It's an incredible honor to have Congressman Eliot Engel and Mike Rogers here, along with David Ignatius, for our next discussion about the crisis in Syria. Before kicking off this timely conversation, I want to welcome again everyone watching on C-SPAN and invite you to join the conversation at #FPI Forum. For those in the audience, a reminder to please submit your questions with the pre-printed cards at your tables. You can see the question box in the center, and we'll bring that up when we move to the Q&A portion of the conversation. David Ignatius is an opinion writer at the Washington Post. In addition to his twice-a-week foreign affairs column and contributions to the Post-Partisan blog, he's written 8 spy novels. I greatly thank Mr. Ignatius for agreeing to moderate this discussion and turn the mic over to him to introduce our panelists who have done so much to advance the debate on Syria.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you to what I hope will be a very good and lively discussion of a difficult policy issue, Syria. You'll have a chance to ask your own questions, so please do be thinking and writing on the cards questions that can be sent up to us so that you can play a part in this conversation. Let me first introduce our panelists, starting on my far right, as it were, Congressman Mike Rogers from Michigan. I often say the same thing in introducing Mike Rogers, which is that he has taken what was one of the most divided and partisan committees in the House Intelligence Committee, and made it function as a bipartisan committee that passes authorization legislation every year. Congressman Rogers has worked with his ranking member, Congressman Rupertsberger from Maryland, and that thing that you wish would happen throughout the Congress, in which members from both parties have each other's backs and try to do the country's work, is actually happening in the House Intelligence Committee, and it's terrific. So I want to say that in introducing Congressman Rogers. Eliot Engel, the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, similarly is somebody who has tried to work on bipartisan solutions to problems that matter to the country. He became a ranking member after Howard Berman, who for many years had been in that position, left the Congress. He's been a member of Congress since 1989 and has had a significant record of legislative achievement and commitment. So it's great to have two people who are really trying to do the people's business in Congress on foreign policy to talk about Syria. And I'd like to ask each of you to begin by setting the scene for us. We've had a turbulent few weeks with Syria policy, in which it appeared that the United States was going to go to war, was going to launch Tomahawk missiles after a very fiery statement by our Secretary of State, John Kerry. And then the President decided that it was wisest to take this matter to Congress and get congressional support. And then, lo and behold, Russian foreign minister and then the Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a willingness to work with the United States to deal with the problem that the military attack had been intended to deal with by having a joint Russian-American program to destroy these weapons. So I'd like to, Congressman Rogers, ask you to begin our conversation by talking about where we are. There's some people who look at this situation and say, oh, this is terrible, the United States is so weak, Putin is the big winner, and it's paint this in very dire colors. What do you think?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the security footprint, if we can, and what's happening in Syria, and lead up to that very quickly. So you have an interesting trend happening now in Syria. You have Al-Qaeda actually disagreeing with itself on the very issue of conducting external operations. So you have a large pooling of Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in the East. That is certainly cause for concern, and in that some friction because they feel they're in a safe enough position in the East should they be conducting external operations to Syria. That in and of itself is a concerning turn of events in Syria. You have Hezbollah still actively working on behalf of the regime in Syria. You have some Kurdish groups, the PKK have some groups up along the Turkish border, and they're looking for some territory that they can claim their own and have. Autonomy is too strong a word, but they want to at least be able to influence events as it happens in the north and the east of Syria. The one negative thing that happened when the ink dried on if there was ink, on the Russian agreement, is that you saw that the Russians and the regime and Iran through Hezbollah used that opportunity to refresh the troops, to restock, to dig in, to take some offensive operations, mainly through artillery strikes and small unit movement, to try to take advantage of that position. I think most people would see that conclusion. So we are seeing a hardened position today. And you know, the result of the Russian agreement, listen, any time that you can have an agreement to take chemical weapons off the battlefield, that's a good day. What worries me is that it was a very narrow focus. I thought we missed an opportunity by trying to stretch that to conventional weapon systems. You know, the rockets that they have, the missile systems that they have, they being the Assad regime, mainly supplied, by the way, through Russian means and Iranian means, is really troubling. So are they stepping over conventional weapon systems? We don't want to fall in the hands of bad guys too? Probably. And that's something I hope that we can re-engage with the Russians pretty quickly. And I reject wholly the people who want to define this as a simple civil war in Syria. We have gone well beyond that point. It is a regional conflict. You have regional concerns in the area trying to influence the outcome in a way that both includes money and arms and even backroom diplomacy that is very, very concerning. Jordan is at risk because of the sheer number of refugees. Israel is obviously very concerned. They, for the first time now, have Al-Qaeda elements on their northern border near the Golan Heights, something they hadn't had to deal with to that degree thus far. Iran is feeling cornered by sanctions, empowered by the events in Syria, and Hezbollah, for the first time, has militiaed up in a way that has caused us real concern. So they militiaed up, departed to another country, engaging in command and control and fighting that, candidly, is very successful. All of that is concerning, and the last piece of this that we need to worry about is the numbers of foreign fighters exceeds the number of foreign fighters we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you think about that for a minute. That sheer number alone should give you pause. And by the way, when it's over, these people will be combat trained, combat hardened, and they're going to want to go home, which means we are going to have a wave of individuals who are committed, who have training that we've not seen before in Europe, and by the way, the United States as well. So all of that we're trying to work through. And I think we're going to have a long debate about what role we should have with the Russians and the Iranians moving forward in Assad's term there in Syria.
I want to come back, Congressman Rogers, to some of what you said. One point in particular about these entrenched Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra fighters and what to do about them. But I want to first ask Congressman Engel if he would take us back to the days immediately after the president's speech, in which the president said, I feel it's important for this action to be fully legitimate, to take it to Congress and get congressional support. It's widely said that one of the surprises and decisive developments of that period was that it appeared increasingly that the president could not hold his own caucus, that House Democrats were unlikely to support the president in sufficient numbers, despite fairly strong lobbying on behalf of this resolution in favor of military action by AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobbying group that is very well connected on Capitol Hill. Some even resented the fact that AIPAC had been pushed into this fight, saying this isn't directly about Israel's security and it's inappropriate to. I ask you first, is it true that the Democratic caucus was iffy, that it was increasingly unlikely that they would support the resolution? And second, were you at all troubled by the linkage of this to more traditional issues involving Israel's security?
Well, I think you have to take the support or lack of support for a strike in Syria in totality, not just look at Democrats, but also look at Republicans. Look, I think the United States is war-weary. We were all hearing from our constituents overwhelmingly that they did not favor any kind of action in Syria. I was one of the few who publicly said I supported a strike in Syria, and I supported it not because I like strikes, but I think that it was a way of telling Assad that, as the president said, using weapons of mass destruction, gas on his own people, is not acceptable. I think that the situation in the Congress was very iffy. First of all, I was one of the people who felt that the president did not have to come to Congress initially. I felt, and still do, with the War Powers Act, gave the president 60 days to come to Congress. I still feel that way. The president felt otherwise. I respect that. And I think that when he came to Capitol Hill, he and his people found that there was a lot of resistance. I think there was, frankly, more resistance on the Republican side than there was on the Democratic side. In fact, it seemed very strange to me that many of my Republican colleagues who had supported the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, Desert Storm, and things like that, suddenly were so opposed to supporting President Obama on strikes in Syria. I mean, it just seemed like a disconnect to me, that it was, frankly, in many instances politically motivated rather than substance. But it was also a hard sell in the Democratic caucus. I think ultimately, and we'll never know, it's all conjecture, if it had come to a vote, I think a majority of Democrats would have supported the president on it. But I think it was iffy in terms of whether the president would get the support of the Congress, because the Republicans were overwhelmingly opposed to it. I've always felt that foreign policy should be bipartisan. I know that Mike's committee, and rightfully so, you complimented the way he's run the committee in a bipartisan fashion. We've tried to do that on the Foreign Affairs Committee with Chairman Royce and myself. We have made it a trademark this year to talk about bipartisanship, because I think wherever possible, foreign policy should be bipartisan. I think it strengthens us, it strengthens our president, whoever he or she may be, and I think it's very important that we keep it in a bipartisan fashion. But I think that was really the reality was, it was very, very iffy, and I think more so because of lack of Republican support. In terms of AIPAC, I don't think it was wrong for AIPAC to get involved. Look, Israel is in that area. It's a very difficult area and a very bad neighborhood. And obviously what happens in Syria is very important for Israel. The Golan Heights is the border, actually, now between Israel and Syria. And as you pointed out, there are lots of pitfalls for Israel. So I think the pro-Israel community, if they decided to get involved with it, did the right thing. And the reaching of AIPAC is not just in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It's really across party lines. I think AIPAC has built the most effective lobbying force of any organization on Capitol Hill, and they have strong ties and influence in both the Democratic caucus and the Republican caucus. I think it was appropriate, if that's what they deemed to do, to get involved. And I think, again, we'll never know what would have happened, because the agreement that the president agreed to with Russia and Syria is a good agreement. I agree with Mike, by the way. It's narrow in scope. I think it was good that it happened, but it still, frankly, troubles me that Assad is still in power after all these years. You may remember I wrote the Syria Accountability Act 10 years ago, got it passed and signed with a Republican Congress and a Republican president, because, again, I think that foreign policy needs to be bipartisan, and Syria has been a bad player. The Assads have been bad players for so many years.
Let me ask you, Congressman Engel, just a brief follow-up. One of the things that was widely said at home and even more abroad was that the president's difficulty in getting congressional support to assert this norm against the use of chemical weapons told the world how war-weary America is, and in that sense was a worrying precedent for the much larger and more consequential issue of Iran and Iran's nuclear program, that the Iranians, probably looking at this, would think it was less likely that President Obama would take the country to war to stop the Iranian nuclear program. I know you've thought a lot about that. What would be your judgment about whether there's anything to worry about here in this as a precedent?
Well, sure, there's something to worry about. I think the Iranians were watching very carefully how the Syria option played out in the United States. I think it was obvious that the United States is war-weary, and I think that they watch us very, very carefully, and that was one of the reasons why I was for striking Syria, because I believe that Assad has essentially turned himself into Iran's proxy in Syria. You know, the war for Assad was going poorly until Hezbollah came across the border and fought on the side of Assad and won back all those towns and was very successful. Of course, Hezbollah is controlled, Hezbollah is a terrorist group, and it's controlled by Iran, and the Iranians want Assad to win. So this is something that's all intertwined. In fact, I think some of the dissatisfaction we're seeing with some of our allies, Saudi Arabia, for instance, with what happened in Syria, plays to the very fact that everyone knows that Iran is there and is watching. But I think that President Obama, to his credit, has said that with Iran, all options are on the table, and just the way I believe that it was the credible threat of American force that forced Assad or forced this agreement on the Syrians and allowed them to agree to it. I think it's the credible threat of American force that will help, if there is to be an agreement with the Iranians, make sure it's a good agreement. And by the way, I'm for an agreement, but I want a good agreement. No agreement, in my opinion, is better than a bad agreement. And again, to the President's credit, he continues to say all options are on the table, and the negotiations that are going on now, I support them, but I obviously believe time is of the essence, and the Iranians are masters at playing for time, and I think we should know, frankly, within a few weeks if they're serious or if they're just kind of trying to string us along.
Happily, this seems to be the situation in which time really doesn't play in their advantage because of the impact of sanctions. I want to ask Congressman Rogers about the next big date on our Syria calendar, and that is the so-called Geneva II conference, which seems to be tentatively set for the third week of November. And for those of you who don't follow this carefully, Geneva II would be a follow-on to the transitional procedures that Kofi Annan negotiated when he was the special representative for Syria a year ago. It's a joint U.S.-Russian project. It's been discussed at great length by Secretary Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. And I want to ask you, Congressman Rogers, whether you think it is possible to achieve anything significant at a Geneva II conference now, and in that sense, whether you support it going forward. And perhaps you could also take this opportunity to discuss one of the issues that's central to this Geneva II conference, which is how can the opposition get strong enough that it can bargain effectively at Geneva and do better on the battlefield?
Well, this is the problem. It was the problem with the first go-round, and it's going to be the problem in Geneva too. Once the deal was done with the Russians, it was done by two entities who were playing very different roles in Syria. And so what happened is General Idris, who is trying to hold together what we would understand as the Free Syrian Army, hopefully free of more radicals, not going to be the case given the tide and how things are turning in Syria. And they felt, and probably legitimately so, that they had gotten their legs cut out from under them. If somebody doesn't have the credibility to tell the opposition, here's where we're going to go forward on a deal, we will get no deal that will hold, period. So we can talk all that we want. And so when we say it's a U.S. and Russian-led event in Syria, that tells me it will not be successful up front. Now, they are the key players. They can be we the United States, they the Russians, because there's very few people that can walk in to Assad and say, that's it, right? No more spare parts, no more weapons, no more gasoline, and no more finances. Your days are numbered. It's time that we move forward on an agreement. They're really the only ones, aside maybe from Iran, who would have no notion to do that, that can play that role. That's why I thought it was important to engage the Russians in the whole process. That being said, who walks into the opposition and says, this is the way forward, Assad is here for 14 months or whatever it is, here's how we do a transitional government, here's how we lay it out, there's going to be a ceasefire for a temporary period of time. No government, including the United States of America, can now do that. The Saudis are frustrated. I think the representative mentioned the Saudis and how they're pulling away from American interests and publicly stating it. That's very concerning. And so you have all the things working against a successful Geneva II. I think that's why Eliot and I both co-sponsored a bill that Eliot authored on trying to find a way forward to arm the opposition, train the opposition in a way that allows us to have friends and influence for a peaceful conclusion. And I know some people think that's a dichotomy by giving weapons and arms and training to the opposition and to have a peaceful conclusion. But we passionately believe that if they're strong enough and have influence enough and can turn the tide on the battlefield, then that's the time the US and the Russians can actually sit down and broker a deal that can be a lasting peace that doesn't create chaos afterward. And candidly today, if Assad was taken out today, we would have chaos in Syria that we will all pay a price for. And so I too believe that Assad needs to go. I think now we're in a very different place than we were 2 years ago, 18 months ago, 12 months ago. The situation has deteriorated so badly that we've got to find a way now to stem the chaos that will follow when he eventually, and he will, leave power. And so that's what I worry about on Geneva II. I don't think we're there. You hear all of the complaints from the opposition that we thought we were promised X, and I think a lot of them thought that meant airplanes and tanks and very sophisticated pieces of weaponry that was never part of the discussion, but their perception was different. And so when all that stuff didn't show up on the battlefield for the opposition in Syria, I think it created this credibility problem, real or perceived. If it's perceived, it's real. And that is the challenge they're going to have walking into Geneva II.
So let me ask you each quickly, before I turn to some excellent questions from our audience, to address the issue that's really at the core of this question of how to make the opposition a stronger, more credible force, and that is a program, a serious, hard-nosed program sponsored by agencies of the U.S. government that would work to train, to some extent arm members of General Idris's force, would help them create commando units, would help them create the kind of command and control muscle that they've needed. Congressman Rogers, you're so close to this, you have to be careful, I guess, but tell us what you can about how this is going, because it's so important in terms of the larger story.
Yeah. I can't talk about specific details, but I can tell you early on, and many of us in a bipartisan way believed that what can the United States bring to impact on the battlefield in Syria early on? Training, nobody does it better than the United States. Intelligence packages, allowing a trained unit that learns command and control, that is armed in a way that can be effective on the battlefield to get to the right place and affect the right outcome in a mission. Nobody does that better than the United States of America. And the other piece of this, which I think got lost in the equation, was the United States trying to corral in what is a whole bunch of countries who have large influence in the region throwing weapon systems over the border and running like heck. And it had some serious consequences. We know that there are nation states that we work well with who don't really care where weapon systems end up. As long as it's pointed at Assad, it's a good day for them. That's not necessarily a good day for U.S. national interests. And so we've had a very difficult time corralling it, and part of it is we've had a reluctance of really sitting at the table and showing U.S. leadership. And you'll hear that complaint from all of our Middle East allies, which is why you see this recent, fairly public discussion of Saudi Arabia pulling away from the United States, which hopefully we can get this fixed and turned around. I think it would be have serious negative consequences for the United States in the long run if Saudi Arabia decided to keep walking down that path. And so what I think the perception problem was, as I said earlier, is that all of this good stuff was going to come. They're going to have well-trained units, and they're going to engage in the fight. The problem is this, that I think the U.S. rhetoric and U.S. resources is a huge gap. And as the situation on the ground has changed, I think both our U.S. rhetoric and our stated goals and intentions should also change. So for anyone that was 24 months ago saying we ought to be all in, we ought to help, we ought to do in a very big, robust, maybe even public way, supporting the opposition in these ways, that circumstance doesn't exist today. And so I think we need to change. We can't keep the same rhetoric when we know on the ground that the more extremist elements are winning the tide of influence amongst the opposition. Why? Better funded, better trained, better committed fighters. And I think our intelligence services are doing a miraculous job of trying to make sure they understand who's who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, who can we trust that maybe when this all falls apart, we'll have some friends on the ground in Syria. But the problem is that just isn't enough. And I think that the longer it goes in our current public stated goal with what we're doing will only create more animosity. I know that I don't mean to be cute by half, but it's a complicated situation on the ground. Change our rhetoric, change our goals, change what we hope to influence when it's done, and try to work with our allies to keep sophisticated weapons away from groups that we know are radicalized. And by the way, again, in the East, we're not talking about 400 or 500 people. We're talking about in excess of 10,000 people, committed Al-Qaeda affiliates. This is a serious problem brewing for us, and I argue on our current policy trend, we're not going to meet that challenge the way we're doing it today.
So what I hear you saying, amid the necessarily careful language, is that the United States needs to have a more aggressive and focused, non-public program to deal with the reality in Syria. Am I getting that right?
I think so. And if your stated goal, let's back up for a minute. And the stated goal, and both Eliot and I agree on this, Assad needs to go. And I think the administration's original policy is Assad needs to go. Great, we're all in. I'm for it, supported that position. But time has changed the facts on the ground. And I don't believe, if that is our stated U.S. intention, that we are configured to make that happen. Matter of fact, I would argue we are not. We're not in a position to do that on the ground in Syria. We have alienated both our allies and the opposition in our stated goals versus our resourced position in Syria on the ground today. So I argue, let's refocus this. Let's sit down and figure out, all right, well, we are where we are. We know we have this growing problem in the East, Turkish issues on the border with Syria and the PPK and others. You have a Hezbollah in the West and in the South. We have got to change our calculus. What do we want to accomplish today? And again, it's a change of position for me, but not. I argue if Assad goes today, we are in serious trouble, not because he's gone, but because the chaos that ensues, and everybody's going to try to get their hands on those sophisticated weapons caches. So we better change, we better reconfigure ourselves, and I happen to believe in covert action. I think it's an important, has played an important role since George Washington engaged in it in the Revolutionary War, that it is a part of advancing U.S. national security interests. Maybe that's a better place for us to do something that can influence the outcome there so that we get a peaceful, less chaotic, more supportive of the allies in the region outcome than what the path I think we're on today.
Congressman Engel, I want to ask you a question that's been posed by one of our audience members, Tom Gofus, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, who identifies himself as a Senate staffer, and asks, what are the U.S. national security interests associated with Syria? And if I might expand that just a bit, we've already dealt with chemical weapons, which are a U.S. national security interest. What we're facing in reality in Syria today, it seems, is the breakup of the unitary state of Syria. It's now effectively cantonized. Does the United States have a national security interest in keeping the nation of Syria within its traditional boundaries together?
Well, you know, I've often questioned how much we should be committed to keeping these essentially colonial boundaries intact. We had that argument during the Iraq War when many of us thought that the Kurds in the northern part of the country should be allowed at the very least autonomy and essentially being allowed to run their own nation. And I think the same could ostensibly be said for Syria. I think Mike very correctly, when he was laying out what happened, 2 years ago we had strong feeling that General Idris and the Free Syria Army would emerge victorious. And as he mentioned, I even put in a bill, which he co-sponsored, to arm the rebels. Things have changed on the ground, and there is a lot of chaos there as well. And so I think we need to reassess what we do now. I still believe that Assad needs to go, because I think that he's a brutal dictator. And I think, unfortunately, that a lot of uprisings start with good intentions. This uprising in Syria started with people who were fed up with the weight of the Assad regime and the way it was strangling the people of Syria, and they did want to have a free Syria that we in the United States would feel very compatible with and a kinship with. But foreign jihadists have been pouring into that country, as Mike mentioned, even to a larger degree than we saw in Iraq. And again, our allies in the region, our close allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, others as well, are right there, and we do have a stake in terms of what happens. So I think that our interests in the region are shifting, and I think we're in the middle of having a shift. But I'll tell you, I really think that the United States still needs to be engaged, and that the cantonization of Syria might very well happen. You know, the King of Jordan came to see us a few months ago in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and laid out, took a map and started drawing, and showed how you would have the division of Syria, and that is essentially what Assad is playing for. I think Assad at this point doesn't care about the north and doesn't care about a lot of the area, but he cares about this enclave, large enclave, including Damascus, the capital, which would abut Lebanon, which would essentially be a Shia enclave, which is why many of us believe he used gas on the suburbs outside of Damascus to sort of ethnic cleanse the area of Sunnis. And so if we think that what happens in Syria doesn't have a spillover effect to all these other countries, including Iran, as we mentioned before, we're very badly mistaken. And so I think that we do have an interest in trying to stabilize Syria and trying to transition to a post-Assad Syria and trying to perhaps do it with the Russians. I think that it's a long shot, but I think that we need to keep trying.
I wonder if either of you here, and let me start with Congressman Engel, hear anything from Secretary Kerry or others at the State Department that would suggest that in recent conversations with Foreign Minister Lavrov, the Russians have finally indicated a recognition that to stabilize the situation in Syria, Assad must leave when his term of office officially expires next year. Congressman, have you heard anything like that?
Well, I haven't heard that. It's something that we would hope, because I think it's true. And we're hoping that the Russians will come to understand that Assad has no future in Syria. I think the agreement that we did with the Russians in terms of getting rid of the gas and the weapons of mass destruction was a good thing. I think something very good came out of all of that. And I'm under no illusions about Putin or about Assad. But I do think that it's good if the United States and Russia can cooperate on this. Russia has also experienced jihadist Islamic terrorism. They don't have a stake in seeing that flourish, and I think they understand that trying to put the lid on what's happening in Syria is not only in the United States' best interest, but ultimately I think it's in Russia's best interest as well.
Congressman Rogers, what do your sources tell you?
Well, we knew early on that the Russians were looking for an interim period of time for Assad to stay in power. That's one of the main things that they wanted. I think in the beginning they were asking for complete staying in as long as he could get elected, and trust me, on that system he would have gotten elected. And then they started adjusting a while back on the number of months that they were willing to negotiate. And of course that collided with the opposition's position that that's non-negotiable. He has to go. If we're going to ceasefire, he has to be gone. And that was the trouble, and that's where the friction, I think, started between U.S. Interlocutor efforts and Russian interlocutor efforts in Syria. So this is not incompatible with their position. I think they feel they're in a pretty good place today because of the chemical weapons agreement. The fact that Assad is pretty much untouchable now between when the end of that chemical weapons agreement happens anyway, which would be pretty close to the election cycle. Would they try to get him another election? I think they'll start there. I think they'll come to the position eventually that they don't have to, that he's going to have to go at some point as well. And just on the national security interest, real quickly if I can, I think this is a classic case of why we ought to re-engage in the world, or at least stand up as a general populace about engagement in the world. Our national security interests in Syria were very clear to many of us from the very beginning. You have a place that has aided and abetted, and some estimates are as high as 600 through cutouts, Iranian cutouts through Syria, in Iraq, taking the lives of 600 U.S. soldiers. This was a proxy state for a nation that was causing bad behavior in the region, including, by the way, trying to kill the Saudi ambassador in the United States Capitol. This is as serious as it gets. And so an earlier intervention, we don't mean military intervention, we're talking about using the training and the assets that we can bring that are very unique to this situation, were in our national security interests. But because we immediately defeated ourselves by saying we're tired of international engagement, we're not going to do this, we waited a very long time, and now we have a cauldron of bad activity. I believe, I think Eliot agrees with this, had an earlier intervention with helping the opposition 2 years ago, you wouldn't see the circumstances on the ground. Why is it in our national security interests today, even more than it was 2 years ago? You have a safe haven developing in the east of Syria, along the Iraqi border, where they're talking about conducting external operations, which is exactly what happened in Afghanistan, which led to 9/11. There are thousands now of people who have come from some Western nations, the United States, other places, who are going to go back. You cannot have a safe haven operate anywhere in the world for people who are committed to acts of terrorism to advance their political goals. The only thing we think that are stopping that now is the fact that there is this struggle between Al-Qaeda core leadership saying, hold off, don't do it yet, we don't want foreign intervention in the fight yet. Right? So they're being paid. They have shown that they've developed a level of patience and strategy that we hadn't seen before. So in other words, let this cauldron go, try to secure some area in the east, and then we'll start and begin planning for external operations. And the fight is that there's a group there now that says, no, 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 we want to do it now. We feel safe and comfortable here. We would like to engage in external operations now. That's what our United States national security interests. We said after 9/11, no more safe havens. We're never going to allow it. What we have happening in Syria today is the development of maybe the largest safe haven without our ability to conduct operations that we've ever seen. That should concern all of us. And again, when we don't make a decision thinking that we're doing some international good or we're tired of being engaged in the world, what you get now is a worse problem. I hope people study this case and study from 24 months ago to today. I think it might reinvigorate people's interest in engaging small and effective early so you don't get big and ugly later. And right now we're at the big and very ugly stage of the Syrian conflict.
Let me turn to two questions from foreign guests that are both in the same direction, and do follow on the comments that you each just made. One is from Yves Raymond from the Embassy of Switzerland, who asks, Iran wants to be involved in the Geneva II conference. What's your take on that? And Cornelius Adebar, who is with the German Council on Foreign Relations, asks, how can you constructively bring Iran into the Syria equation? Congressman Engel, what do you think about that? Should Iran have a seat at Geneva II? What should be the requirements for their participation? Can they help or will they hurt?
Well, I think the first pressing problem with Iran is getting them to get rid of their nuclear weapons. I think that trumps everything else. And I think in large part how they act towards that goal will determine whether Iran will be taken seriously in terms of a player for peace in the region or as someone who has committed all kinds of inappropriate behavior in the region. I view Iran as the major supporter and financer of terrorism in the entire world. And that is a record of, again, I mentioned Hezbollah before. Iran has been a particularly bad player, so I don't think that they should be rewarded or elevated as someone who can be constructive in terms of Syria. I think let them first show that they'll be constructive in terms of dismantling their nuclear program. And I think that's what we have to concentrate on right now. So I would be opposed to Iran having any kind of a role in Syria in the talks unless they show that they're serious and trying to be responsible in terms of dismantling their nuclear weapons program. And I think there has to be more than just, you know, trying to act charming. The new president, it's unclear to me what responsibilities he has, Rouhani. It's unclear to me if this is more just window dressing or if it's real. So if it's real, I'm happy if it's real, but I have my doubts, and let's wait and see before we start elevating Iran as peacemakers.
Interestingly, I interviewed President Rouhani one-on-one when he was here, and he said pretty much the same thing. Let's do the nuclear file first, then let's deal with these regional issues. And the reason is that he seems to have authority from the Supreme Leader to do the nuclear file. He does not have authority to deal on Syria, Bahrain, other regional crises, which are closely held by the IRGC. Mike, do you have a thought about the wisdom of bringing Iran into this process?
I completely agree with Eliot. I would not have them sit at the table unless they had a very long laundry lists of must-dos prior to. They have not negotiated in good faith on the nuclear. Remember, this isn't the first, just because it's Rouhani, who I think people have said with some sense of euphoria, oh, we're done here, this is great, he's with us. That just simply hasn't been the case. So in all of the other nuclear talks, the most productive thing was an agreement to have more nuclear talks. That's it. That's what we got out of it. And I don't see any change here today. Remember where Iran is today? So they're actively supporting Hezbollah in Syria. They've conducted well over a dozen political assassination attempts worldwide, external to Iran, again, including the attempt here in the United States of America, our capital. They attacked Saudi Aramco with a vicious cyber attack that nearly took it offline and crippled their main cash flow, basically, in Saudi Arabia. It does all their oil and natural gas transactions with a very, very devastating cyber destructive attack. According to public reports, Iran has been probing aggressively in the hundreds of times just this year alone our financial services networks in a way that would give one pause. To say that we're going to allow those folks, the credibility of which that's what they want here, they want this international credibility that comes with sitting at the table, so that they're in a better position to negotiate their nuclear issues and ever eventually what's happening in Syria. I just think it would be unwise at best and really damaging to our ability to control what is the leading largest supplier of international terrorism on the face of the earth when it comes to a state government.
Let me run through a few more questions from our audience just briefly. One is a Twitter message from, the Twitter account is at Mayhill, I think it is, or Maybill. But the question is, how threatened is the Jordanian monarchy by spillover from Syria? Congressman Engel, that's the thing that I hear the most about when I talk to Israeli sources about the situation, that as a Sunni jihad gets stronger and stronger in Syria, the consequences for the king in Jordan become more serious. What do you hear? What do you think? What should the U.S. do about it?
Well, first of all, I think the U.S. needs to do everything possible to work closely with the King of Jordan. Jordan has been a loyal and trusted ally of the United States for many, many years, not only in this crisis, but in many other crises. And Jordan is feeling the weight of refugees, hundreds of thousands of refugees pouring across their border from Syria into Jordan. We have been helping with that. We have been helping a lot with that. But I think that the king is very, very concerned and very, very worried. You know, whenever he comes to Washington to speak with us, I always feel that it's like a breath of fresh air coming from that region because he really, I think, you know, has it all together, understands what's going on, and has a very clear head in terms of what the United States and the West and the rest should do. So I think if anything happened to his regime, it would be devastating to our policies, and we need to be looked upon as somebody who is loyal and a nation that stays with our allies and keeps with them and protects them. And I think Jordan is one of those very, very important allies. But clearly in Jordan, they're feeling the strain right now of all these refugees and the war right next door in Syria.
Is there something new that we should be doing, Congressman Engel or Congressman Rogers, to help Jordan and to go to this question of Jordanian stability?
Well, I think we should just continue what we've done. We provide a lot of humanitarian relief. We in some degree, are an umbrella of protecting the military, protecting them. We need to encourage good relations between Jordan and Egypt, between Jordan and Israel, between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And we need to let them know that we're dependable. What Mike said before is very, very true. People rely on the United States. People have to know that we're a dependable ally. It's good policy for us to be a dependable ally, but it's also good policy for us in terms of what we need. Al-Qaeda was planning and plotting when we weren't going after them. When the Soviet Union was thrown, the Russians were thrown out of Afghanistan, we sort of packed up and went home. And we allowed that country to fester instead of making sure that the Taliban didn't rear its ugly head. We cannot afford to do that anymore. I know that people feel, well, we're all tired. We're all tired, but we have responsibilities not only as the leading power of the world, we have responsibilities to ourselves. I'm a New Yorker. I remember September 11, 2001 like it was yesterday. It's one of the visceral moments in my life, probably in everybody's life. We have to be vigilant, and we need to work to make sure that the people who would do us harm are prevented from doing it, and that the people who are allied with us, the nations like Jordan that are allied with us, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, that are allied with us, that we work with them so it's a two-way street. It protects them and keeps them working with us, but it also protects us.
Yeah, imagine if 100 million people showed up in the United States in the next 3 or 4 months. I mean, it would be a devastating problem for us to keep up with. And that's basically what's happening in Jordan. And I've been in the camps along the border, and it's all they can do to keep up with water and sanitary issues. They built a camp in the middle, literally the middle of nowhere, to hold 10,000 people. So they're trying to create a small town on the border, and it filled up in 4 days. And they have small towns along that border that have more than doubled the population, because they have an interesting, if you have relatives across the border, you can come in and go and live in that community. So they have doubled the size of these small towns in a very short order that already had water and sewer issues. I mean, it is a real problem. And we're also seeing certainly the Syrians are understanding that there is flames to be fanned by penetrating these camps and causing trouble. And we see lots of trouble brewing in these camps. And I do believe that you could trace this right back to Damascus and bad behavior. And all of that is adding pressure on a country that has very little resources to offer its own people, let alone literally hundreds of thousands of people who aren't citizens of Jordan. So we're going to have to continue to step up and help them. We need the international community to do more than they're doing. And candidly, one of the things that we can do is help try to contain the refugee flow by trying to offer some areas of stability in Syria that allow people to find a safe haven of their own. And I'm talking about a good safe haven, not a bad safe haven in this case, where they don't feel that they have to cross the border in order to protect their families. And it's populated with young girls and kids their parents are telling them to flee. It is a tragic event to walk through these camps and meet these young folks who have been displaced by some pretty awful combat fighting in Syria. So all of those things need to happen all at the same time. And it's other than events like this, we don't talk about Syria much anymore. After the big kerfuffle over should we do a surgical strike on their ability to deliver chemical weapons or not, we have moved on as Americans. And I think that's a tragedy if we don't put a little more effort and emphasis on trying to solve this problem.
Let me ask for one more quick response from Congressman Rogers, because this is an important question, and then we will conclude our session. This is from Robert Zarate from the Foreign Policy Initiative. And he asks, how confident are you that Assad will really give, and then he quotes the language, immediate and unfettered access, which is what's demanded, to all chemical weapons sites and declare every chemical weapons transfer in or out of Syria since 1946, as he is required to do by Article 3 of the Chemical Weapons Convention? What's your confidence level in what we're doing?
Well, what we're trying to do, my confidence level is high. I think they're trying, and they're going to do the best that they can. My confidence level is extremely low that we're going to have access to all the sites that we need. Remember, at one time, they were talking about as many as 42 sites. Now, the OPCW has been, I think, to 14, 15 will follow shortly. And in the time that they've been there, they have found equipment used to manufacture, but we have tons of this stuff left. And I think that we are fooling ourselves if we think that they haven't short-shirted that if there isn't a black set of books on the chemical weapons program, I'll eat that table. Clearly there is. They're going to try to game the system.
Never make a bet you can't keep.
Oh yeah. Well, look at the size of me. I think I probably could eat that table. I do worry that we think it's done and it's neat and it's clean and we've got a clean solution. This is not something we should walk away from very delicately. We need to continue intelligence gathering to find the gaps. We are seeing some disturbing reports about moving some of the excess in certain places in areas that would certainly benefit the regime. All of those things are happening all at the same time. So I have very low confidence that we're going to get it all. As I said, am I glad that we're getting our hands on some of the production equipment? You bet. I think that's a good outcome. But we shouldn't just, as we said, close the book and think that we've done everything we need to do on their chemical weapons program in Syria.
So I just want to say, as moderator, any day when you get a sensible bipartisan discussion about a big foreign policy issue and you end up knowing more than you did at the beginning is a good day. And so I want to thank Congressman Rogers, Congressman Engel for an excellent discussion. Thank all of you. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you very much. Thanks, David. Thanks, Eliot. Good to see you.